Welcome to One Work, Five Questions with Dr. Mark Holochak and Dave Dietrich. Yay. Today is our 70th episode of One Work, Five
I have to
Questions.
stop you there real fast. I have to go get a pointy thing. Pencil. You can keep going while I get my pointy thing.
Okay.
Can't talk with
I thought he was joking. Okay. Well, I'll give you the background on Dr. Holochak and his pointy thing. He's a retired.
Here, it matches my shirt too, by the way. Look at that.
Oh, okay. He's a professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden, Ohio University, and Ohio University. I'm sorry. And he has published over 27 books on Thomas Jefferson. And oh, hi, Jeffy. And he has over 200 essays on Thomas Jefferson. With the show One Work, Five Questions, I'll ask Dr. Holochak 5 questions on one work of Thomas Jefferson. And today's episode is Thomas Jefferson. He wrote a letter to Abigail Adams dated the 13th of June, 1804. And this is in response to her letter to him. So we've got 3 letters going in this episode.
We're going to focus on the one letter, obviously, but we're going to be referring to the other 2 as well.
Right. Okay. And Dave, I'm going to let you take it off with question number 1.
Okay. Thank you, Donna. Question number 1. What was the context of this letter from Abigail Adams? After over 15 years of silence, what motivated her to write to TJ?
Well, Jefferson's daughter, Maria, had died, and hey, the mail truck's coming late, albeit. And Abigail was very close to Maria, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but let me just say something about the relationship of Jefferson and Abigail. Notice there were 82 letters from 1785, 1788 when Abigail's in London with her husband and Jefferson's in Paris. So it's considerable correspondence he carried. And I've read through those at some point. So they were very, very close. And she had a very emotional bond, a tight emotional bond with Thomas, and he very much liked her. After 1788, when John Adams gets to the presidency, we know there's tension between Jefferson and John Adams, and such that John Adams does not even show up when Jefferson's inaugurated as president. He leaves town, and they do not resume any correspondence, Abigail, at least, and Thomas, till 1804 when Maria dies. And Abigail's really broken about this because when Maria, who was Mary at the time, was sent to in the summer of 1787, sent to England first, and then en route to go into Paris, the Adams pick up Maria and Sally Hemings, in June of 1787, I think it is. And Abigail gets very close to Maria. Maria's 8 at the time, and she considers Maria to be very sweet. Remember the famous 2 letters talks about how Sally Hemings is more immature than Maria. Sally Hemings is 14. But Abigail, shows an emotional tender side of her, really loved Maria very closely. And as much, I think we'll see that Abigail's a woman, if you wrong her or get her angry, she stays angry forever. But the death of Maria broke her down. Let me see if I have something here. Had you been no other than the private inhabitant of Monticello, I should ever this time have arrested you with that sympathy which a recent event had awakened to my bosom, but reasons of various kinds withheld my pen until the powerful feelings of my heart, having burst through the restraint and called upon me to shed the tear of sorrow over the departed remains of your beloved and deserving daughter, an event I most sincerely mourn. I'll read one more passage from the letter. She says, so in other words, so far, I was content never talking to you again, Thomas, but when you told me Maria died, it broke my heart. and I just had to share my condolences. All right, she adds, the attachment which I formed for her when you committed her to my care upon her arrival in a foreign land has remained with me to this hour, and the recent account of her death, which I read in the late paper, brought fresh to my remembrance the strong sensibility she discovered, though but a child of 9 years, she was 8, at being separated from her friends and country and brought, as she expressed it, to a strange land amongst strangers. The tender scene of her separation from me rose to my recollection when she clung around my neck and wet my bosom with her tears, saying, "Oh, now I have learned to love you. Why will they tear me from you?" So Maria got really lovey-dovey with Abigail, and she was crying, didn't want to go see her dad. She hadn't seen much of her dad, and Abigail became like a pseudo mother. So she recalls those moments with great tenderness, which shows that Abigail was a woman capable of great tenderness and great and powerful attachments, emotional attachments. Anything else to add on that? I mean,
just an incidental set of factoids, I guess, for the listeners. Often Jefferson's younger daughter, surviving daughter, that is, into adulthood, is referred to by several names. Her nickname was Polly because she was apparently, effervescent and talkative. Then you hear the name Mary. You also hear the name Maria and also Mariah. Mariah is basically a Southern version of the name Maria. And so, what name did she use? What name did Jefferson use? We know Polly, we know Mary. Mariah is a possibility as well. The French would have called her Maria, of course, when she was in France. So the readers and the listeners are going to probably see several types of names associated with her.
Yeah, Mariah is probably the preferred name once she's done with France. And I always call her Maria, but I think Jefferson probably called her Mariah most of the time. After France now, is that because his youngest daughter didn't look like him? She was actually looked like his wife. She was quite beautiful from what we know. And did Mary remind Jefferson of Maria Cosway? Who knows? So why does he stop calling her? Like you said, he called her Polly most of the time but when she gets to a certain age, those nicknames go away. And it's Martha and Mariah.
Are we ready for question number 2?
Sure.
So.
Okay. Can you say more about Abigail Adams' relationship to Mary Jefferson in London?
I pretty much answered that in question 1. In her letter, she talks about how she was emotionally attached to Mary Jefferson as she comes across the boat. And again, this is in June of 1787. And one thing that happens is that Jefferson sends his main man, a certain Pettit, to pick up Sally Hemings and Mary Jefferson at the time. And Abigail was sort of flabbergasted by that. Now, Jefferson had been touring France and Italy at the time, I believe, and northern Italy and South France, and he was behind on his political duties, presumably, and he didn't have the time. But Abigail penned in a letter to something to the extent that I can't believe that he didn't himself come to pick up his own daughter. He sends, an emissary at Sir Pettit or something, and she's right. Jefferson should drop everything he's doing to go by himself to pick up his daughter, even though she probably wouldn't recognize him. So Abigail, that's strike 1 against Thomas right there. Abigail, chides Jefferson in some sense for that. But again, there was a very strong emotional attachment between the two. Mary winds up not wanting to leave Abigail, so they had some very emotional and tender moments together. not even to be with her father, and that's that. I mean, so there was a strong relationship between the two. Probably, you know, as we're going to see, a good reason for Abigail's sort of aggressiveness in her response to Jefferson's letter, which we'll talk about later.
You know, it's kind of interesting because you look at some of the other letters, particularly the ones during the times that the Adamses and Jefferson were in Europe. They would Abigail and Thomas would exchange letters, and they got in a sort of friendly banter, I guess, if that's a proper term, over, for example, the society in France as opposed to the society in Britain. And of course, the short of it was Abigail was kind of an Anglophile in that sense. Jefferson saw great virtue in French society. And so they would kind of go to the mats over that. And that was kind of interesting. I mean, you know, how does it relate to all this? It's almost like they have a love-hate type of intellectual discourse among them that lasts for quite some time. I mean, there may be other interpretations of that, but it's just something I wanted to throw out there.
Yeah, they talk about other things that would be considered womanly when Jefferson's going out to buy statues and stuff for her, and so he would shop for her and she for him and so forth. But what you mentioned is to say that there was an intellectual relationship, and that needs to be underscored because she was a highly intelligent woman. And as I believe, I do think she ran the roost back in Quincy, Massachusetts. I think she was, I'll tell you why in a bit, but I think she was a very highly intelligent and capable woman and wanted things done her way. And didn't, from my estimation, she didn't like to bend her will, at least not too often, unless she had to. That's all I got to say about number 2. I didn't have much to say because I did a lot in number 1.
Pretty good. You ready for question 3?
I'm always ready for question 3.
All
Maybe
right.
not 4, but 3.
Thomas Jefferson clearly is thankful in his letter to Abigail Adams for her condolences. Would you agree with that, or do you have other thoughts on that, Doctor?
No, you know, he says that. I mean, let me read what he says and comment on it. Because I'm thankful for the occasion furnished me of expressing my regret that circumstances should have arisen which have seemed to draw a line of separation between us. The friendship with which you honored me has ever been valued and fully reciprocated. So I've always valued your relationship, and you've valued mine equally as well. And although events have been passing which might be trying to some minds, I never believed yours to be of that kind or felt that my own was. Neither my estimate of your character nor the esteemed founding in that have ever been lessened for a single moment, though doubts whether it would be acceptable may have forbidden manifestations of it. So he's alluding to the difficulties, for the most part, Jefferson faced as vice president to Adams. You know, as I mentioned, that the high Federalists in his cabinet sort of disallowed any sort of real relationship between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and John Adams would have preferred there to be a tight relationship. He says when they reconcile, he says, I always loved Jefferson. And I really believe that Adams, I have argued in several publications that Adams had a need for Thomas Jefferson's love and friendship. Jefferson didn't need Adams. But we'll talk about this on another occasion. I don't know of any correspondence between any of the founding fathers that is more fascinating than the correspondence between Jefferson and Adams. Because with me being a philosopher, it is a very philosophical correspondence and very rich in metaphysics, epistemology, theory of knowledge, ethics, especially religious matters. So it's just a lot of fun for me to read through those philosophical letters. And as I said, I do plan on doing the philosophical letters between the two with a critical analysis. That'll be my next Jefferson project. But really, yeah, Jefferson did not hate people. I need to add that. He held it against John Adams for what John Adams did. We'll talk about that. The judicial appointments, we've talked about that in other episodes. The midnight appointments where he's heading out of office, so he brings in a bunch of different judges, Federalist judges to be put in. Jefferson, we'll talk about in a bit, was incensed by that, and that forced his hand to some extent. But all things considered, he wasn't one to hold a grudge. He never did. My dog doesn't know whether he wants to get on my lap or not. Come on. He wasn't one to hold it. Relax, boy. He wasn't one to hold a grudge. And as we're going to see, Abigail did. But I think he was excited, and he must have been really, really moved by the letter. I'll leave it at that. I know the question 4 is by Donna. You're going to ask that, and I know you've got some stuff to say.
Yes. Yeah. There's
you almost tore my head off, and when we were talking about this earlier, just talking about this. So
there's a lot to talk about.
Okay, we'll just ask the question, and I'll give you.
So, question 4, he felt like this was the opportunity to bring up why he hadn't spoken with her husband. And he writes, I can say with truth that one act of Mr. Adams's life, and only one, ever gave me a moment's personal displeasure. I did consider his last appointments to office as personally unkind. And he's referring to the midnight appointments, which ended up in the Marbury versus Madison case. They were from among my most ardent political enemies, from whom no faithful cooperation could ever be expected, and laid me under the embarrassment of acting through men whose views were to defeat mine, or to encounter the odium of putting others in their places. It seemed but common justice to leave a successor free to act by instruments of his own choice. And my question is, why does he bring this up when she was just writing to offer condolences?
Well, you and I probably going to disagree on this, but I think he brings it up because he wants to be authentic and honest, that there's a reason why, your husband and I haven't been writing to each other, during my presidency, or, and that reason is because he's still angry. He wasn't very happy about the Alien Sedition Acts, by the way, during his Adams presidency, and he's even more upset about these midnight appointments, about which we've talked in a different episode. And he says, I can only one act in Mr. Adams' life, and one only ever gave me a moment's personal displeasure. Right? Yeah, you read that, and Jefferson is really angered by that. And what I think he's trying to do, in my estimation, is be honest with her, clear the air. Okay, you're writing me a letter. Maybe this is a great time for reconciliation, for rapprochement, and I'm just going to let you know what's bothering me. And if you feel like it, you can tell me what's bothering you. And Jefferson's always one for conciliation. Then we can go from there and be friends again. That's what I think he's doing. Jefferson was not one. I think he sees this as a very wonderful opportunity to resume a valued and treasured friendship.
But in the letter,
what's this? Is that the
but in the letter that Abigail responds when she responds to this letter, she brings up the details about a calendar and a $50 payment that was made by Jefferson. What was that all about?
Well, talk about that a little bit in the last question, but Jefferson calendar, Dave talked about this last time, I think a little bit, was a very suspicious character. He was a scandal monger and had no friends, and he would do anything for a buck to get, he wanted to be Postmaster General of Richmond, as we talked about before, and he would do anything for a buck. So he trashed, when he came to America, he trashed Washington. He was in the habit of trashing of Adams. And so it pissed John Adams off, of course. John Adams was very thin-skinned. And of course, it angered Abigail Adams because she always stuck up for her man. And
Did Jefferson pay him though to do that?
yes, he did. And that opens up another can of worms. To what extent Jefferson, I think, saw Callender as a worthwhile adversary. He early on came to see him as someone who had a fairly gifted pen and could do some work for Republicanism, some political work for Republicanism. So that opened up a can of worms about Jefferson's complicity and, Jefferson behaving politic here and not behaving in a morally responsible manner. Those are serious questions to consider. We can talk about them later. Abigail's, she goes on to say her letter is, talk about that in a bit. She's miffed about that, and there's something else about which she doesn't talk. She's miffed about that Jefferson. She wanted John Quincy Adams to assume some role in Jefferson's presidency. Jefferson didn't bring him in, and Jefferson, that comes out in another letter. Jefferson later says, "Well, I didn't know anything about this, about you wanting your son to be part of my administration, in some sense, or to have some post." And I take it that Jefferson's being sincere. He didn't know. She was mad about that as well. But I'll add one more thing, and you can come back at me. We don't know what was going on in Quincy, Massachusetts, in the household. The sort of discussion that John Adams had with his wife about Jefferson. Adams was a person who very, very frequently would befriend you and speak in a very amicable manner one way, and then when he's behind closed doors, just say, "This guy's a complete ass." Jefferson was not wont to do that.
Yeah, well, I think Abigail made it pretty clear that what her husband did by doing the midnight appointments, it wasn't personal against him, even though Thomas Jefferson took it personal. It wasn't personal, and she stated the evidence that it wasn't personal because she didn't even know that he was going to be president at the time those midnight appointments were made. That was her position. And then in her response, she took it personal what Jefferson did to her husband with Callender. So I think that's why she could never forgive him.
I don't know. I think there's a whole complex of things. Like, again, I said, because Adams wanted to be reelected as president without question. Adams had that sort of Napoleon complex, if you want to call it that. And he was so upset by losing to Jefferson that he left Washington and not even, come on. You can't even congratulate Jefferson. They were so close in the Continental Congress. And I have to point the finger at John Adams quite a bit. Again, he was very thin-skinned, very easy to anger, and that's common knowledge, just not my opinion. And not winning the presidency, and I don't think it was so much, as federalism versus republicanism at the time. It's just he wanted the presidency, and Jefferson got it. And maybe this was a vindication of Jefferson's republicanist political views over the sort of federalism that Adams tended to adopt. He had high federalists in his cabinet. So, we'll talk more. Dave's going to ask the last question. I'll get into particulars, but do you have anything to add on that, Dave, in terms of Callender? And
I think you hit it right, the nail right on the head.
I love metaphors, by the way.
It speaks. It really speaks at what we know about the character of James T. Callender. And you could argue, as you're suggesting, that maybe Jefferson mistook him from the beginning. Thought he was useful, as you say, but then very quickly realized that there was a dark side to the gentleman.
Right.
And of course, the irony is that both sides used the Callender.
Yeah.
Both sides took a hit as a result of that too. Another metaphor.
Okay. You guys are teaming up on me today. My goodness.
Well, isn't Callender the one who who eventually started the rumor about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings?
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
Okay.
And I enjoyed your Voltairean butt there when you rebutted Dr. Holacek a few moments ago. Very philosophical. I was waiting for a philosophical tale. That's what Voltaire used to do. He'd get into a philosophical debate, and then he'd go, "Yes, but." That was good.
All right, we're actually doing pretty well time-wise for the first time. So Miss Vitek's not doing too much blabbing, I guess, right?
That was very good.
Yeah.
Okay, ready for question 5?
Yeah.
Okay, Abigail Adams replies with a long letter, 1,280 words long. Man, I guess there wasn't much to do in Quincy, Massachusetts.
I counted them.
Did you? Wow.
My computer
I guess
did.
there's not a lot to do in Lynchburg these days either.
I had a lot to do. I had to use fingers, toes, and my dog's fingers and toes and things like that.
There you go.
And the freckles on his back.
And I assume we're talking about the 13th June 1804 letter, correct?
Her response to that, Jefferson.
Her response to that. Okay,
her
gotcha.
response to it, subsequent response.
So what's the gist of that letter, and what's the gist of her replies, I guess, the response?
Well, Donna talked about the very fact that she writes such a long letter, 1,280 words, is Jefferson opened the floodgates. What pisses her off is what Donna said, is that, Jefferson should have said, I don't agree with this, but she's thinking, maybe Jefferson just should have said, thank you for your condolences. And I'm glad you're thinking about me. But he goes on to say, the only thing that ever made me angry with your husband, and, he's talking about those midnight appointments. And she picks up on that, and that opens the floodgates. And she just,
well, if you want to go there, then let's dump it all out.
Yeah. And Jefferson is just throwing, he's being honest. Jefferson's an honest guy. He's just like saying, this is the one thing that really made me mad, and I'm going to pour out my soul. And then she's pouring out with 1,280 different problems she has with Jefferson. I'm hyperbolizing just to make Dave happy. But she's using metaphors. So she comes back with just a flood of problems with Thomas Jefferson. And I personally, don't think it's a fair fight. What shows me is that Jefferson coming out and saying the only thing that ever made me angry, I know you're ready to say something, Don, but you can, just let me finish, is this one thing. And I think Jefferson's really mad. He's not even mad about the Alien Sedition Acts. I've forgiven them. But, she comes out and she's been holding in a lot of stuff. She's the sort of, like, Jefferson is fine. Let's reconcile, forgive, and all that, move on. And it's like she's holding it all in, and she's just waiting. Okay, I'll write you a letter. It's almost like in the back of her mind, I'll write you a letter, Tom. But if you say anything bad about my husband, boy, I'm gonna in a boxing match, I've got you in the corner, and I'm just gonna unleash on you.
She's a good wife.
She does.
She's a good wife.
She could be called that. She could be called, other things as well. She says, in your letter of June 13th came duly to hand if it had contained no other sentiments and opinion than those which my letter of condolence could have excited, and which are expressed in your first page of reply, our correspondence would have terminated here. So in other words, she still doesn't want anything to do with Thomas. Even if Thomas didn't include that, the only thing that bothered me about him, she just said, yeah, if you would just responded and said, thank you for acknowledging the death of my daughter. And I would come back with another thank you. And then that's that. Then we can go on not writing to each other, basically, she said. That's my take on it. Would have terminated here, right? Then she goes on to say, one act of Mr. Adams' life and only one you repeat ever gave me a moment, Then she says the Constitution empowers the president to fill up offices as they become vacant, right? Adams is not filling up vacant offices. He's creating offices. So it's not a matter of filling up vacant. He's creating offices. to give Federalists more judiciary power everywhere. If they can't control the Congress and the executive, they're going to control the judicial. So she's wrong to say that. She says, well, the president can do that. The Constitution allows him to do that. But she's not quite getting the story right there. You talk about calendar. Okay, she says, I have never felt any enmity, well, let me finish this, towards you, sir, for being elected president of the United States, but the instruments made use of and the means by which were practiced to effect the change have my utter abhorrence and detestation, where they were the blackest calumny. She's blaming Jefferson for Calendar's calumny, and I don't think that's right. Jefferson is paying a Calendar to dump on the Federalists. He's not paying Calendar to dump necessarily on John Adams,
right?
As far as I see it. So, yeah, he says, at the time of election, I considered your pretensions much superior to his, to whom an equal vote was given. In other words, my husband's. So then she goes out and talk about, I rely upon the friendship you still profess for me, and I'm conscious I have done nothing to forfeit it. So she's exonerating herself. I have done nothing. Okay. And she talks about liberating the wretch Calendar, and she goes out and talks a lot about that. So, you know, that Calendar, the fact is that Jefferson's not paying Calendar to attack her husband. He's paying Calendar in some sense to attack the Federalists. That Calendar attacks Washington. He did that before in Jefferson's. Then he attacked Adams. Is not of Jefferson's doing, but he does, you know, he does get him out of prison, Calendar out of prison. Part of the Alien Sedition Acts, by the way, we have to say Calendar's prison. So at some point, she comes out with just a flood of objections to Jefferson and shows that she had a lot bottled up in her. Now, you wanted to say something like that.
Did Jefferson respond to this?
No, that in effect, they had other letters later on. I haven't read through the letters, but this was enough for Thomas Jefferson to say, the hell with it. I really don't want much to do with her anymore. And at some point, I think it was a wise decision on her part. I think, as I said, there were 10 more letters between the two from 1804, from the first letter she writes. Yeah, 10 letters from 1804 till she dies. And yeah, and they're polite and formal. I can say I do have something in the last thing she says in one. Yeah, I don't know where I have that, but she, in the very last letter she writes to Thomas Jefferson, she writes a letter, I think it's her last letter, because she loses one of her own daughters. And in some sense, I had it somewhere, I don't know where I put the letter, but she, yeah, I don't know where I put that, but yeah, oh, here it is. It says, I read this at the wrong time. The last letter from Abigail when her daughter dies. She says, but although time has changed the outward form and political back-wounding calumny, the calendar, for a period interrupted the friendly discourse in harmony which subsisted, it is again removed, purified from the dross. So she basically says in the last letter she writes to Jefferson, you're my friend again. Too much has happened. My daughter has died now, and at some point, you and my husband are writing, and your friendship is renewed and stronger than it's ever been. I'm tired of hating you. She's basically saying so. But I don't think Thomas has any inclination to write her again. To me, he's also a very thin-skinned person, and his concern is, you know, if I open up again to you, you might tear my head off again. I think that's what he's worried about. Anybody agree with that or disagree? Or
Well, he was, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I would also might add that he was a stoic. And so why get emotional about something that you really can't control other than your own actions? And your actions is the cease and desist with the writing.
Yeah, and in following the Stoic line, why take the chance of writing another letter, being honest about how you feel, which he was, and then run the risk of having the floodgates open again and
But
lambasted.
why is he afforded the right to be honest about how he feels and she's not? She's considered aggressive when she does it. That's not.
Because there are a large number of things that Jefferson could have, in my estimation, that could have pointed out that her husband did. Right? He made Thomas Jefferson a non-entity as vice president because the cabinet. He let his cabinet do that. There were a large number of things that could have bothered Jefferson. And Jefferson comes back, and I think he's honest. He said, there's only one thing that really bothered her. From her point of view, there were a large number of things that bothered her. I'm not saying he's right and she's wrong. It's just he has more of an inclination to let things bounce off him.
Yeah.
He bottles up her resentment and anger. He doesn't.
Yeah, and that's not meant to be a put down of Abigail. It's just different personalities.
Well, maybe something as simple as male female.
Could be.
I mean, just how
you're
females.
opening up the floodgates there, Vitek. You know, you're for our listeners going to say, you know, you're going to make me a misogynist here.
I have to stand up. It's 2-1 here. I have to stand up for the women.
Well, Dave's the misogynist when you get to
No. For the record, Dave Dietrich is not.
Well, we've got
Bless you.
120 left. What are we going to do next time? And
Okay, next week we're going to return to the real Thomas Jefferson. Having studied and critically analyzed the 1998 DNA study and shown what we are entitled to conclude, we turn next to the Thomas Jefferson Foundation's Thomas Jefferson Foundation's 2000 assessment of the DNA study, along with what historians have had to say about TJ and Sally Hemings. Was that study legitimate, or were there a political angle involved? So we're going to be commenting on that next week. So kind of an extension.
You're going to be doing a proceeds of the thing that leads into discussion, I assume, right?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
All right, exactly. Then I say from Stone Library here in Quincy, Massachusetts, thank you guys. Merry Christmas, and TTFN, as Catwoman for Batman, you say, ta-ta for now.
And thank you, and here from 18th century London.
Yeah.
I still say it's French Rococo.
Y'all have